Welcome back to the archive. My name's BJ.
My name's Connor.
And in today's episode, we're going to be going over the Union of Opposites segment and everything that entails.
Now, I think it's no secret right now that we are polarized as a nation, and maybe even on a global scale. And I think BJ wants to talk a little bit about what polarization entails, and that might help give some insight into why we started this process to begin with.
Yeah, so everybody knows what polarization is in a general sense, right? Especially in the terms of politics.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is on one side or another. Everything's tribalized, everybody has an opposition, people that they hate. So that's pretty much the general definition of polarization. But there's another definition that a lot of people aren't really aware of, and it comes from the Hermetic Principles, which is a philosophy of ancient wisdom texts, as well as the Tao Te Ching, and other major world religious ideas and philosophies kind of play into this idea of polarity and polarization in terms of metaphysics and how the reality structure comes to be and what that means. And hermetically, polarity sort of means that all things require opposition in order to exist. So literally, in order for light to exist, darkness needs to exist. And for goodness to exist, badness needs to exist. And in this segment, in this series of episodes that we're doing, it's really our goal to try to highlight those polar opposites to kind of find where those points of contention are occurring, where people are, butting heads a lot, and trying to find ways to reconcile them and bring them closer into the middle, into a nuanced middle ground.
Right. And even if you don't agree with the Hermetic principle of polarization, you still have to acknowledge the fact that without your ability to conceptualize light, you would have nothing to compare it to know what dark is. Same thing is true with good and evil.
Exactly. And so there's a lot of arguments that we're going to be diving into deeply in this series, but ultimately that's what it is, right? We're just kind of going over the differences on any major given topic. We'll give some examples here in a little bit, and trying to find our way into the middle ground. And there's more to be said about that as well.
Right, because the idea of unifying opposites isn't something that we made up. It's talked about a lot in esoteric texts and
Alchemy
and the occult and whatnot.
Karl
And so
Jung.
we're just the first ones to codify it into a video format that's accessible on YouTube or whatever video platform we happen to release them on.
Exactly. And so there's one last thing to be said in general. Yes, there are polar opposites all across the spectrum: black, white, life, death, hatred, love,
Truth, lies.
yeah, so on and so forth. But within those poles, within those polarities, there's a whole spectrum in which a plethora of phenomena can unfold.
Sure.
And within that spectrum, there are more poles. There are other polarized oppositions that aren't necessarily true poles, as
Right.
we call light and darkness or life and death. And so an example of an episode that we might talk about that has true polarity would be life and death, or hatred versus love,
Right.
or whatever. But a more nuanced episode title might be old religion versus the new age.
Sure.
Old religion versus the new age. And different iterations of that. So I just wanted to make it clear so there's no confusion now going forward that it's not always going to be true polarities that we're discussing. We do want to get into the meat and bones and the nuance of all of these things as we try to better ourselves and make positive changes in our communities.
And I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the reason why we decided to do this is because when you go into the world that is the internet, it's pretty clear that people are constantly at opposition with each other, almost to the point where it seems impossible that the opposition could really truly understand your perspective. And so we believe that a video like this or a segment like this can actually show people how two things can inch together to synergize in a way that's actually not separate and transcendent. Right.
So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into a couple of examples of why the union of opposites is necessary in our opinion.
Right.
Let's jump in. So one of the hugest reasons that we want to actually do the union of opposites is because we see in our lives, everywhere we turn, a state of complete and utter polarization. In social media, in our friends and family, in the way that we treat our loved ones, at work when we have to code switch and be different people at work because we're afraid of saying, anything that could get us fired or sued or whatever. And because of this hyperpolarized state, we feel it's necessary to do this segment.
Right. And that leads us to the conversation of tribalism. And, it's very clear when you go online that people are tribalistically attached to their ideas, but that wasn't always the case. Tribalism was usually predicated on your race or your nationality, but it's only been recently that we've kind of really attached ourselves to our ideas, and we have this innate proclivity to want to say, I'm on the team that thinks this, but that's ultimately a conflation of ideas and identity, because if you're a healthy-minded person, your ideas should be ever-changing, and you should always be willing to have new information challenge your previous preconceptions.
And so on that same idea of the conflation of idea and identity, I talk about it in another video, but it's something that we're passionate about.
Yes.
I mean, honestly, in today's day and age, in the postmodern epoch, people seem to have forgotten that ideas are just that, right? That we've truly taken our ideas on as things that we embody, that we believe to encodify our actual identity.
Right.
And when that happens, when you don't treat ideas as fun toys that exist in the cloud, that you pull down out of the cloud and roll about in your hand and then pass back and forth and discuss and then put back neatly at the end of the conversation, and treat it that way, treat discussions just like that,
Right.
not so frivolously to call them toys. I mean, ideas are very important things, but to treat them in that manner is important. And in today's era, what I'm observing, and maybe you agree with me, I think you do, is people have, rather than pull them out of the clouds and roll them about and then put them back, they've worn them as tunics.
Right. And imagine if somebody tried to define you with the ideas that you had when you were 16 years old. And that's kind of what we do today with cancel culture. We say, well, you don't have the right to reserve, you don't reserve the right to change your opinion over a long period of time. We've decided because you once thought this, that you are X blank
Forever.
always. Yeah.
And that being said, when you wear your ideas like that and you judge others based on their ideas, you run the risk of being canceled, and you also run the risk of stopping conversation and discourse right dead in its tracks. Because if I disagree with an opinion that you have, it's no longer a disagreement on an idea.
Right.
It's I've rubbed dirt on your name, or I've literally wronged you somehow. I've come at you directly and actually attacked your personal character, or at least your perception of yourself. And that leads to cancel culture, people blocking each other on social media, heated arguments that end in just fists flying, or ultimately just no progress between two people with differing opinions. No one learns anything, and it's really, you wasted energy that day.
Right, and you bring up a good point. We have this great tool called the internet where we can actually discuss ideas with people all across the world, and in people in different mind pools than the one that we happen to inhabit. But we take it for granted when we block people simply because we disagree, because we don't. We should assume, kind of like Peterson always says, is that you should assume the person you're talking to knows something that you don't know, and you should talk to them in such a way that they might tell it to you.
I think that's awesome, because truly no one knows everything.
Right.
Right? It's completely arrogant. And even if you're a professional in your field, you can always learn from other people. You can learn from the ignorant as you teach them.
Right.
Sometimes you're like, oh, wow, during this conversation where there was an open dialogue, I tried to think of this idea in a way that makes sense to the layman, and there was an epiphany moment, and now, oh, wow, like I actually learned something. I put two pieces of information together in my head that were already there, but they didn't actually communicate before in a way that gave me this new insight.
Right, and the same goes for someone you might consider evil. You can learn what not to be by observing their behavior or by talking to them.
Right, and then you also don't give them an opportunity to learn from you or change.
Right.
If you block them on social media, they no longer can see your inspirational posts. They can never have an opportunity to debate with you. Maybe their ideas in 6 months from now are going to have changed. Maybe they've grown a little bit, or maybe they haven't, but you'll never know because you actually blocked them.
Right, because if you truly wanted the world to be a better place and you saw somebody who was espousing a bad idea, your instinct really should be to try to offer perspective as to why they shouldn't think that.
Right, absolutely. Because again, I mean, you learn from if you learn from every instance and every interaction, that's the best mode of being, in our opinion, when we go about our lives. And to speak on the internet a little bit, yes, we live in the information age now as well, where there's a plethora of information, so many people that you can talk to all over the globe, and we're not really taking advantage of that, I think, in general. And maybe I'll just speak for myself when I say that, because I don't know every single person on planet Earth, but when I observe my friends and family and how they're using their time on social media, it's not really trying to have conversations with other people, and that's okay. But really what I want to highlight is that the nature of the internet has become more and more polarized, simply because at the end user experience, companies, media companies, tech companies, and marketing companies, everybody is just marketing to you as best as they can. And your experience on the internet is becoming more and more tailored to you as an individual. And my time spent on the internet, the websites I visit, the ads that show up are all going to be completely different for me than from you. And my recommended YouTube feed, my recommended playlist for music on Pandora and SiriusXM or any other place like that, it's all going to be different than yours.
Right.
And if we continue this social meme, I guess, of blocking people, or this trend, I suppose, of not sharing ideas, and our physical environment is changing and our social construct is changing in the way that it is, we will only continue to worsen and chaos will only continue to climb. And so that is one of the huge reasons why I feel like we need to discuss this thing and why we're, creating this whole entire segment.
And we all know that the internet is a vector for propaganda and fake news, but we as individuals can actually operate in the internet in such a way that doesn't exacerbate that, I think. And I think the union of opposites is a great place to start.
And now to discuss a couple of general principles with the union of opposites, now that we've kind of gone over the why and a brief explanation of what it is as a segment. Really, to bring it back up, there's a lot of ancient wisdom traditions, written texts, religious ideas, philosophies, in which two polarized opposites, in truth, are part of one unified whole.
Right. The most basic example is the yin and yang symbol. You see that they're separated and they're kind of almost at opposition, but they're part of the same design. They're part of the same symbol.
Exactly. They're part of one whole entire symbol. Even mainstream science today, Newtonian physics and optics and light, scientists will talk about how light and darkness are sort of very similar in nature, or hot and cold are they're basically the same thing that's occurring with different phenomenological outcomes depending on circumstance. But electricity and polarized charges and everything in the physical world, to some degree, when the phenomena is being expressed or are being expressed as multiplicities or two opposites, they're usually like two faces on the same coin, like heads and tails.
Right. And the psychological example would be love and hate. They say the same neurochemicals are activated in moments of intimacy as they are in moments of intense rage. And that's, kind of funny because the people that you love the most are the ones who are able to make you the most angry. So it's...
And like laughter and crying.
Exactly.
Right? They're very similar emotions. So all across the spectrum, polarized opposites seem to be conjoined at the hip a little bit. Like, again, two sides of the same coin, to use the old cliche. That being said, I kind of want to bring up integral philosophy. So integral philosophy is a huge aspect of our entire movement, what we want to accomplish. Comes from Ken Wilber.
Right. We touched on it a little bit in our foundational episode.
Yep. The book's behind us. For anybody watching the video stream right now or the video feed, they'll find some Ken Wilber books. Also in the description, I'll put a couple of them for anybody who's watching. But essentially, when it comes to trying to unify opposition and integrate opposites, the goal, at least with this segment, again, is to find a nuanced middle ground with people who are in disagreement with each other. But that doesn't always work. That doesn't actually always happen in reality. And part of integral philosophy is recognizing that we cannot actually ever ascend or transcend from our current position in life by destroying the foundation. So what that means is if all opposition is taken to be part of the same whole, then in order to transcend both good and bad, we have to somehow figure out a way to go beyond both good and bad to a new third level in which good and bad together allow us to get there.
Right.
It's called ascension. And again, you can't, if you're building a building, to give a metaphor, and you only have a certain level, amount of bricks, so you have 1,000 bricks and you're going to build this small building, and in this metaphor, for the sake of argument, you never get any new bricks, ever. And you build it one story. And then all of a sudden you find 500 bricks laying around and you're like, okay, I have these new materials. I can build a new story. I can build 2 stories. Well, if you go and you destroy the 1,000 bricks that you laid at first because you don't like them or because they're damaged or corrupted or they got some mold on them or something, you're only going to be able to build your house back up 500 more bricks, but you've destroyed the first 1,000, so you're not going anywhere.
Right.
Or 1,000 for 1,000. Yeah, you're not going to expand at all.
Right.
Just be right where you stayed. Maybe the bricks are a different color, a different flavor, a different architecture, but you're still in the same place. You're just, the illusion of difference hangs above you in all of the shingles and cool things that you built with your 500 or 1,000 bricks. And that's sort of a metaphor that explains integral philosophy and its motivation. By ascending, by using those bad bricks, by figuring out a way to do that. And again, you do that with the conjoining the old bricks with the new bricks in a way that is integral, that they come together and they work in synergy with each other.
One of the most well-known truisms in psychology is that you never repress. You always integrate. So if you have something that's plaguing you, if you try to repress it, it will always come back with vengeance. And so what BJ is elucidating is the metaphysical aspect of that. You want to try to integrate all ideas and all aspects of reality into one amalgam in order to encapsulate everything.
100%. And it's good that you bring up psychology too, because neurosis, neurotic tendencies, psychosis, crazy things can happen. Anger, depression, sadness, when people try to repress their feelings or when they, suppress things. And all of the great psychologists, psychoanalysts will tell you.
And that's the first thing people say, though, is when you say that you're supposed to integrate everything, they'll say, what about hatred? It's like, yeah, especially that. In a healthy way, of course, not like where you're just spewing hatred off into anybody you see, but in a way that's controlled and recognized.
And that's very difficult in practice. And what does that mean practically? How do you do that pragmatically? Like that's a great question. In different schools, in the alchemical schools, it's called the great work.
Right.
In Jungian psychology, it's shadow work. There's a ton of different terms and jargon in all of the schools of thought that you can use to describe, coming to the wholly individuated, actualized self in your psychology, and to clear up those neurotic tendencies that you've built over your lifetime as you've run away from or suppressed or dissociated from your problems or your demons or your shadow, which is your opposite, your polar opposite inside of yourself. And so this concept works all the way across the spectrum, from psychology to your actual physical well-being to, metaphysics and philosophy to politics and literally our ethics, how we live. And so it's very, very difficult to have a discussion about how we should ascend or transcend. What does that even mean? And how are we going to get there? It's very, very difficult, but that's, again, what we're trying to accomplish in this series.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up alchemy, too, because alchemy is the process of transmutation. The metaphor that they always use is they're trying to transmute lead into gold, but ultimately the deeper metaphor is to transmute your emotions and your thoughts. And what we're trying to do with the union of opposites is to do just that, to transmute your ideas so that you can understand both perspectives and kind of step outside of your
limited perspective,
or your innate preconceptions or whatever.
Your innate preconceptions or your proclivity to behave one way or think one way. And it's cool that we both kind of brought up alchemy as well, because the whole principle of transmutation, changing one object into another or changing one mental state into another, is all predicated on the idea that the prima materia, or the original material that underlies all things, the material that's behind my hand and your shirt and this chair, it's all the same. An
Easterner might call it the Tao.
The Tao, yeah, or the singularity, or whatever. The atoms that build all of these things in the physical space are actually all the same thing, just configured slightly differently with slightly different, I guess, charges and molecules but really, ultimately, at the floor of everything, potentially, it's all the same.
Right, which is true scientifically, too. Like, if you believe in the Big Bang, you have to believe that everything was once one singular point that was the same material that expanded outwards and eventually transmuted into other things.
Right, and so, yeah.
And representations.
Yep, and that brings it back to the alchemical principle of prima materia, which, in their conceptualization, it's if all things come from one thing, then really it was just a sequence of events and consequences that led to the creation of a multiplicity of chemicals and people and colors and feelings. And if we can somehow understand that process of evolution, then we can tweak it manually and write it backwards or forwards or left and right in order to go from something like lead all the way over to gold. Or you could potentially even create a human being out of a bed of ashes or something. It's magic, right? But that concept of going from one thing to another through the process of one actual thing that they're all sort of illusions of while expressing themselves as different things is the nature of integral philosophy and what we're trying to accomplish with the union of opposites together.
Right, which is why that anytime you attempt to unify two poles, you're going to end up coming across another subset of different poles all along the way, and it's going to be a challenge for us, but we hope to do that in such a way that's comprehensive.
Exactly. And so with integral philosophy, again, one of the major tenets is that there is truth in all things. Every single person, every single philosophy, every religion, they all have some sliver or segment of this absolute truth, I suppose. And some people may argue against that there's no absolute truth, that it's all, perspective and it's all relative. And we are going to be discussing that idea in a future episode. But it is our belief, personally, that there is some semblance of truth out there that truly exists that we can reach for and aspire towards. And if we look for that truth everywhere, under every rock, in every pebble, in every book, in every person's experience, and we start looking for that truth in even those people that we disagree with, that we think are terrible human beings, to try to see their perspective or to see how they got the way they were, or to even just understand their ideas for the sake of understanding their ideas, I feel like we'll be able to extrapolate those truths in a way that's meaningful. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to embody those ideas or behave like that person that we are disgusted by. It just means that we have been able to step outside of ourselves and utilize our sense of reason in the way that reason is most intended for, which is truly to go outside of the self, right? And to transcend the self by integrating other and the opposite in the world with what is within you. And I think really ultimately that's what I am hoping to get across with this channel, and I'm sure you as well. I mean, for sure.
We recognize that everybody has their own life experiences and their own biases and whatnot, and we're not asking anybody to not have those, because it's really impossible to extricate yourself from them. What we're asking is that for a moment, when you engage in these videos, that you can step outside of yourself and try at least the best you can, because it's not always easy for me or BJ either, but to step outside of yourself and look at what the opposition has to say and try to deeply consider it in a way that might maybe not completely or radically change what you already thought, but at least offer perspective as to why the other person thinks differently.
And so I guess the last thing that I'll say with that is, again, integrally, if you cannot achieve that middle ground, if it's just not possible in that moment, live and let live, right?
Exactly.
Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance is something that I'm really big on. It basically says we should be tolerant of all peoples except for those who are fundamentally intolerant. And that's a huge concept that we're going to unpack in future videos, but to say that, I mean, and it is a paradox and it's hard to wrestle with it, but ultimately let everyone be as they are, let everyone be incorrect. We should still try to correct them, and we should try to ourselves find the correct answers. And, we shouldn't sit in our neurotic tendencies. We shouldn't be comfortable living in lies or being on the wrong side of whatever is right and wrong. But that being said, we should always allow the opposition to continue existing to the degree that they aren't themselves fundamentally intolerant. And that is a very, very difficult ethical bill to actually pay for and actually practice. But again, that's what we're going to be demonstrating in this channel. That's what we're going to be demonstrating in this series and in this segment. And we're very excited And I don't think there's much else that I really have to say about it. Couple of examples of Union of Opposites episodes.
Maybe we could just give the ones that are coming out next. I think the first one we're going to do is New Age versus Old Religion. We also have one on free will versus determinism, truth versus lies.
There's also one that's sort of a nuanced philosophical discussion around a person named Rene Guénon and a book that he wrote called The Reign of Quantity.
Mm-hmm.
And that Union of Opposites episode is called Unity versus Uniformity.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a lot actually recorded. There's a lot ready to go. We're really excited to release it.
And we also have a list of like 100 that we haven't done yet.
So many. So there's content all day coming.
Right.
And again, you, the viewers and the listeners, if you're audio only, send us suggestions. When you start watching these segments or listening in and something comes to mind and you really want us to discuss something, send it over. And if it's something that we are not really familiar with, because of course, our specialty is in religion, philosophy, a little science here and there, depending on what it is, and a couple of other things, I really am interested in learning. And with this channel, again, we want to learn as much as we teach. We don't want to be
And if you
pedantic.
feel like you can teach us, you're also welcome to come on the show. Just email us at thearchiveowl@gmail.com and we can make that happen.
We'll go over into the discourse series segments and we'll all have a discussion and it'll be fun. We can do it together. Again, we're not trying to sit on a pedestal. We don't want to tell people that we're right and they're wrong. In fact, I'm trying to tell you that even if you're wrong, you are somewhat potentially right.
Right.
So, it sounds like a conundrum or a contradiction, but that's how I feel about the world, and that's what I believe is true. And thank you guys for sticking to the end of this video. If you did, you're awesome.
All right, so with that, we thank you for joining us. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We do have a Facebook page. If you want to find more of our content, you can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Google, iTunes, pretty much all the platforms, and yeah.
Yeah, and with that, we just want to thank you for joining us and continuing the great conversation.